Welcome. Thank you for coming. Our breakout session is going to be maximizing system performance for your P21 ecosystem. So we'll get right into some intros. So, President Brad Feeks.
Hello, everyone. Like most presidents, I get to come for the first slide and then I'll let the smart people take over. I'm blessed to get to work with a lot of smart people. Caleb and Brent are certainly among them. So my contribution to all this, one of these times I've tried to make a database full of all the Rocky movies, but the database crashed due to all the sequels. Okay, all right, first joke connected, so it's all downhill from here. Biggest reason we're doing this session was last year, what we found when people were coming to us, quite often the tasks at hand had to do with system performance. What we did not have last year, anybody come to us and say, hey, I just want you to know my P21 performance is awesome. Everything's great, it's responsive, the users are happy, everything is where it could be. So we thought to ourselves, okay, that's kind of a problem we're trying to solve constantly in our normal cloud hosting environment. So if you don't know, we do a lot of hosting of the P21 application up into private cloud environments, which gives us a lot of opportunity to try to fine tune all the knobs and pull all the stops to try and get performance working optimally. So this, guys, we are presenting, so
Brad, man.
yeah. Okay, so yeah, this is our opportunity here to try to jump in and help tell you guys what we've seen work in the past. So from here, I will take it over to our guys.
Our microphone is live. Careful what you say.
Yeah, I'm also not gonna add either, which is why I'm trying to like whisper.
Excellent. Hey guys, thanks for joining. Okay, we're presenting, so we're gonna get going.
Cue the music.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us, Brad and Marshall. We've got a Teams meeting up right now, virtual call. They're gonna help with some of our slides, so I'll send it up. All right. All right, so my name is Caleb. I'm a senior systems engineer with the EstesGroup. This is my first Connect event, so I figured I would bore you a little bit with some of my backstory, and then we can jump into a whole bunch of content. So I'm from Colorado. I live on the Front Range, if you're familiar. Our headquarters is in Loveland, so I'm just south of there. And also, it's kind of cool, I'm about an hour east of Estes Park, which is how our company name was founded. So it's awesome. And Rocky Mountain National Park is up there as well. We've been up there a bunch this summer. So if you're into fishing, hiking, camping, find me after the event or after this breakout session, LinkedIn, that sort of thing. I'll send you to the right places, hopefully. I'm also a veteran, so I was enlisted 4 years in the Marine Corps. I was in Camp Pendleton, and then shortly before I got out, my wife had joined the Navy, moved to Norfolk, Virginia, and that's when I went to school at Old Dominion University out there. And I picked up a bachelor's in business analytics and also IT. And after my wife got out, we went back home to Colorado, found a master's program, computer information systems, great program, Colorado State University. And then shortly before I graduated that program, I had found one of our part owners for the EstesGroup. It was outside of the town I was living at the time, Berthoud, and there was a private lake, and it turns out he's a part owner of an IT company. I was looking out for an IT job, so a little bit later I was hired. So it's been a busy past couple of years, 2.5 years. One of the main things I do at the EstesGroup is I help in migration projects. So I've been involved, or I'm currently involved in over 25 projects, and that's on-prem to cloud, cloud to cloud, on-prem to on-prem, you name it. And of those 25, I've managed or currently manage 15 of them. So it's been busy. I'm constantly learning, always looking for ways to improve, and working with our partners is a great opportunity for that. And this is also through our relationship with Epicor, so I'm really excited and grateful to be here. This is our one of our senior consultants, Brent Merritt.
How are y'all? Mine's pretty quick. You'll find this with Estes. I'm also a veteran, 12 years pararescue. got out of the military, went to school, ended up working at a company here in Dallas, and then ended up Oklahoma, back in Arkansas, and went to work for an MRO supplier as the IT manager with Acclaim in 2003 for close to 15 years, and then went to another MRO supplier in Minnesota, where also P21. This is my 20th WWUG. I have not missed one. As a matter of fact, I met my wife at the WWUG 10 years ago. She's also attending, so it's been great. As far as the EstesGroup goes, they contacted me, said, "Can you do some work for us?" Apparently, the customer was impressed, and the owner of the company called me and said, "Congratulations." And I said, "For what?" And he said, "For coming to the team." And I said, "I have no idea what you're talking about." And he came back and he said, "You're coming to work for us." I said, "Okay." And next thing I know, I'm working for Estes. I've been there about a year. So when you look at us, when you look at me, I've been on your side for 20 good years. And I've just jumped the side of the fence to be able to help a lot of you, because there's not a whole lot that I have not seen within the P21 environment. I've watched it grow from a 1-hour phone call in support to it takes 4 days to get a response. And that's what we do. We fill that gap. We do the stuff that you want to have happen, you either don't have time to have happen, so we fill that gap, or we help you get to where you want to go. But thank you.
Thanks, Brian. We also have 2 virtual members with the senior consultant, Brad Vandenbogard. You might know him as well. And then Marshall Douglas. He's another senior systems engineer with the EstesGroup. Can you hear us all right, guys?
Yep, sir.
Awesome. All right, let's do this. All right, so this breakout session, hopefully we can help you improve the performance of your P21 ecosystem. And you can take some items back home with you that you can implement right away. And then maybe some other stuff you can start planning for and get those in the works. This session is really important because tuning your ecosystem to maximize performance is going to help your business run better. Things like more profit, less downtime, streamlined shipping and delivery, order processing, better dashboards, and better access to data. Those are going to help your business run better. So we're constantly trying to achieve the most out of these P21 ecosystems, and it's a journey, not a destination. So it's pretty significant. These are some of the topics we're cover here. We'll go over performance, but also the application, the desktop versus web. We'll hit the server sizing guide, some database and SQL Server stuff, load balancing. Also get into configuring your web server, some infrastructure design, and if we have some use cases and demos, we'll get into that as well. Before we get into the actual performance of these, let's kind of go over some of the details of the applications themselves. Desktop app, it's going to run on your terminal server, or it can run on your workstation, that sort of thing. This is what's called a 2-tier model. So you have a client, that client talks to SQL Server. So it's 2 tiers, and then all the different access methods. So this is generally available within your network if you're connected to one of your branches. You can also set up a gateway, so if you're external to the network, that sort of thing. And then you can roll out VPN clients as well. So for the remote workforce, especially in the past few years, it's important. And then you're technically inside the network with the VPN client. You can also access different deployment tools. So RDS is a common one, remote desktop services. You can also distribute remote desktop connections so that, group policy is one of those. And you can also set this up to be public facing as well. And then the web app, this runs on a web server. So the web server is Windows based, and this is basically a Microsoft web server that runs on Windows that users can connect to. This is the 3-tier model. So basically you have a web client, talks to your middleware, talks to SQL. So that's where the 3-tier model comes in. Access methods are about the same. If you have a browser, that's obviously the difference with the desktop client. If you have a browser, you can connect, And then the deployment methods are the same as well. If you're within the corporate network, one of the branches, you get a URL, you connect. You can also do public facing and VPN clients as well. With public facing, we highly recommend increasing your security stance. Things like multi-factor authentication, identity management is going to help add that protection of security, that layer of security, excuse me. Let's get into some of the advantages. The advantages for the desktop app is a little lonely up there. We put user familiarity as one. This is sort of just a front-end performance thing. I mean, if you have a user who's been using the desktop client for a long time, that performance is just going to be better on the front end for them than the web UI. The two-tier model is also an advantage when we're thinking about the zeros and ones, bytes flowing, less hops, the better. So put that in the advantage column for that. Some of the advantages for the web UI, the web application, you get a modern interface, so that's really helpful for users. Browser-based accessibility is great. So if you have browser, whatever it is, Chrome, Safari, Edge, that sort of thing. Logging is also a great advantage for the web application. You can't really get more logging out of the client, so you can change your logging level on the web application, which is great if you're troubleshooting, that sort of thing. Device agnostic is another important one. So with the desktop client, without anything special configured, you basically just run it on Windows, right? So with the web app, if you have a browser, this can run on Mac OS, Windows, Android, iOS, that sort of stuff. Also with the tuning, so IIS is Internet Information Services, there's tuning involved, whereas the desktop client, you install it and that's sort of it. And then load balancing is another one. We'll get into some slides about that. API is also a great one as well. You can connect to the API for the middleware server rather than having your clients, reporting tools and stuff like that, have an ODBC directly to SQL Server. So these are all advantages of both the desktop client and the web application. Now let's get into some of the disadvantages as well. So with the desktop application, printing is up there. I'm sure a lot of you have ran into the redirected printers within the desktop client. So that's a disadvantage for a couple reasons. So if you have, say, 20 printers that are available on the network, that sort of thing. So you go into P21, you see those 20 printers, you sift through. But also if they're installed on, say, a workstation or they're available within the network somewhere, then that's when you start seeing the redirected printers, and there's just issues with a user going in and trying to print redirected printers. And also with the desktop, we kind of lightly touched on that as well. There's no performance tuning, and then your operating system availability is limited. We included RDS in here as well, remote desktop services. Through that, is it a disadvantage? It's also an advantage, obviously, if you can deploy your application in different ways. RDS is going to help you. But with RDS, it adds complexity. So for that reason alone, it's a disadvantage as well. And the web application disadvantages is the installation and configuration that comes with it. So if you need just the middleware, you run the install, and the setup is going to come with its own configurations. And the web application as well. So things like external server names, you have to have your wildcard cert updated in there, scheduler location. So stuff like that, it's to your advantage in the end, but the complexity is where we throw it in the disadvantage column as well. Printing is another one. It's nice when you can log into the web UI and you're using your default printing profile, and your printer is available on your workstation, so you're good to go, no problems. But where it goes as a slight disadvantage is that if you have to use like a network location, or we introduced the Edge agent as well. Some of you might be familiar with the Edge agent. And so just that extra layer of install, configuration, and complexity is a slight disadvantage rather than the simple desktop client printing. Integrations is also, it's an advantage, but also a slight disadvantage as well. when you're adding third-party integrations or vendor-specific integrations, that's just more complexity. So when it comes time to do like version upgrades, things like that, just adds that extra layer of configuration and things you have to consider. Web-based is also an issue. So IIS and web-based applications can be finicky. You've probably been asked to clear your browser cache and cookies, probably a bunch. So on the back end, that can be a slight disadvantage as well. And then familiarity is obviously another one. Lots of conversations with organizations who are still on the desktop client only. Some are hybrid, a lot trying to go from hybrid to full web UI. So that's a disadvantage as well. Next, we'll get into the server sizing guide. So this is just, we'll get into the middleware server, virtual machine. This is also, you can go to Epic Web and download this hardware requirements from Epicor. Epicor's recommendations, you can see the chart on the right. So this is our number of users versus number of servers chart. Epicor recommends 75 users for a play and production instance. We've seen more than that, but basically 75 users is where it starts. You can see 75 users, you can, one middleware server, and then as you start moving to the right, you add more servers. The recommended processors is 4 CPUs, and they provide entry and better level performance. So because P21 is single threaded, the most bang for your buck is going to be getting more gigahertz per core for your processors. And then the memory for one server for up to 75 users is 48 gigabytes of RAM. Please feel free if you have any questions while we're doing this. We have a lot of content, but feel free to ask them. Next, we'll get into SQL Server Virtual Machine Sizing Guide. So similar on the right, we've got the number of users and the respective CPU and RAM that's with it. So we start at 75 users, recommended 4 processors, 96 gigs of RAM, and then also the same thing, single-threaded, your clock speed on your processors is where you're going to get the best performance out of these options. And then as you add more users, they add more cores and more RAM. And these are based on the number of users they have. They also recommend that you separate the operating system, your application, and your SQL components. So having separate drives for, say, your database master data file, your MDF, the LDS for your log files, and then tempdb for SQL Server. Set those up on different drives, and that's going to help improve performance. Also at the bottom, we see a note over here. So all these specifications that are above 128 gigabytes of RAM for SQL Server, you're going to have to up your SQL Server edition to Enterprise. So that comes with some extra licensing costs and things like that. So something to keep in mind. All right, cool. Now we have database administration, and this is where we'll introduce Brad. Can you hear us, Brad?
Okay.
Awesome. All right, all yours, my friend.
All right. 1 second here. I just had a. Sorry, 1 sec.
Yeah, no worries. I'll share a screen here too so we can follow along.
How big is your screen? There.
It's on my laptop. 15.
Oh, so you're not presenting on a large overhead or anything.
Oh no, we definitely have a big screen up here. Yep.
Okay, so everyone can see that slides. So if I share my screen, everyone can see my screen.
So they're all looking at the presentation canvas up here, the project screen.
Okay, all right. Well, because I was gonna do a little visual because some of the stuff is easier with visual than
Okay.
If I share, will they see it on that screen?
Negative.
Okay. All right, so Caleb mentioned about disk sizing and stuff for SQL Server. One of the next things after that, once you figure out your block size on your drives should be set to 64K when you're setting up SQL drives, just because the way SQL manages pages are usually, well, more times than not, especially for SQL Server, they're 8K in size, and then there's 8 pages in what's called an extent. So it works out to be 64 kilobytes. So that's what your disk sizing, your block size should be. When you're setting up drives, it's often overlooked because the default is usually 4K or 8K, which can significantly degrade disk I/O performance, especially when SQL is trying to do multi-threading and stuff. It really hampers its performance. And then there's a couple of other key settings to note, often also go under notice, and there's lots of chatter on the internet about it, so much chatter about max degree of parallelism and cost threshold for parallelism. These settings are found in the database instance level. If you go to the properties of the server, you can find them in there. Now, SQL Server itself is NUMA aware. So, meaning you've got multiple CPUs, and then you've got cores per CPU. Same rule applies in a virtual environment because you can have virtual sockets and virtual CPU counts inside of those sockets. It's the same whether it's physical or virtual. The only difference would be the hypervisor getting into something else would manage how those NUMAs are segmented out. But that being said, you have your max degree of parallelism. So if you've got 4 cores or 4 virtual CPUs, 1 socket or 1 NUMA node, you can set your degree of parallelism. That basically means, can SQL Server go parallel when executing large queries that bring back a lot of rows? Is everything okay? Can people hear me?
Yeah, doing great.
Okay. So SQL says, hey, if you set that up to max degree of parallelism, I can go parallel on large queries. But you may not want to set that at 0. 0 says, hey, use all the processors. But you may not want to set it at 1 either. If you set it at 1, you're basically telling SQL you're never going parallel. So if you've got large queries and you've got a lot of little queries running, the large queries are going to wait, or the little queries are going to wait, especially once the large query executes and it can't go parallel, then your little tiny queries are going to sit and wait and wait and wait. And that could be a search in P21, it could be anything. So now your database is latched and it's just sitting there waiting, so time will go by and users get frustrated. So that's what that interprets into. Then you've got your cost threshold for parallelism. I don't know how many, I can't see a show of hands, so how many people are familiar with it. Query plan estimator in SQL, where you can determine what the cost of a query is. SQL will estimate a query before it actually executes it to see if it's going to need parallel execution in that. And
Yeah, we
so
got a
that
question,
max
Brad.
degree,
Sorry,
Yep.
1 minute. Yeah, question?
So I have a question going back to the setting for parallelism. You said don't set it to 0, but you might not want to set it to 1. So where do we want to look at setting it? What's it?
So-
Good recommendations.
So there's two settings for cost threshold for parallelism and max degree of parallelism work in conjunction with each other. So the cost threshold is tell SQL how long do I wait, or what is the cost of the query threshold before I go parallel and ask for more CPU resources to help execute the query. The max degree of parallelism, you may not want to set the maximum to the maximum number of CPUs. The reason being, if SQL Server determines that a query is gonna go parallel, you may wanna throttle that to be somewhere between 1 and the maximum number of cores you have, so it sets aside CPU resources for smaller queries. Because if you say you're running a huge query that you've got an inventory usage report or a sales history report, and someone clicks the, I wanna run this wide open. Whoops. So now, if you set your max degree of parallelism to 8, because you've got 8 cores, you're telling SQL, go ahead and use everything I got.
Yeah.
Now, users that are running searches in the web
And
UI and stuff like that,
Yeah, it kills
it's
performance.
it's gonna throttle them way down to nothing.
Yeah.
Now I would have had, I have some cool little queries that you can run that say, how do I know if a query has gone parallel? So I can identify those expensive queries who may be performance to them. If they're P21 application specific, you have to wait for Apple Core development to improve those. That being said, people have asked, one of the biggest performance issues of the web UI was the search queries were very compute intensive. In 23.1, they significantly improved those, and I've done some data analysis on how expensive those queries are from an older version to a newer version, and there's a significant improvement in 23.1 on the searches. So that was, most people are like, my web UI runs really slow. Well, where does it run slow? 9 times out of 10, most people come back and say, oh, the searches. Or when I'm searching for an item to enter it in order entry, or when I'm searching for an item in item master inquiry, or item maintenance, or customer master inquiry, and I'm looking up sales history, statistics, and stuff like that. Any of those search windows take a lot of time. So you can change these settings and adjust them to see, like for instance, cost threshold for parallelism. Everyone used to duck for cover if you set it at like 45 or 50 back in early SQL days, but that was back when CPU performance was lower, RAM speed was lower. Now you can set it at 50 without really, sweating too much about it. So it's one of those things that you can change it on the fly. You can execute a query. What I would suggest doing, if you want to take the time to see, is run a profiler, SQL profiler, see what report is being run that has an expensive query, profile that query, copy and paste it in, run the query, and at the same time, query the dynamic management views to see what the threshold or the cost of that is, or you can even run the query plan estimator, and you can right-click on the select statement, and it will tell you the estimated cost. If it says it's like 150 or 160 or something as the cost, and your cost threshold for parallelism is 50, there's your answer. SQL is going to want to run that with a parallel processor. If you've got it set for 1, holy smokes. Pack up and go home before your users come and lynch you at your door. So you want to make sure that you've got those set. It's kind of a tweaking. I often used to, my old company I worked for, we had 300 and something P21 users, 350 or 375. And we had a lot of reports running and a lot of things. So we had 2 instances of SQL Server, one for reporting and one for live, and we had 8 cores each. And I used to set on the reporting database, I used to set the max degree of parallelism to equal the number of CPU data, if you will. So there's lots of things you can do to see what queries are using lots of resources, but a lot of these DMV queries, you can only run them while the query is running, because it will only spit out, show results as the query is executing. It's not an after the fact storing that data in the database, because it's a real-time query on the query, if you will. So,
So hopefully you can replicate and test, right? And then run it.
So
yeah,
is a good starting point for testing, maybe, setting the value based at 50% of your max number of cores. So if we have 8 cores, set it at 4, see how it performs. And this would be on production P21 SQL, because like Brad is saying, we have a separate reporting server. Okay, we can do something different on that, but production SQL, we set it to 50% of our number of cores and then see how things perform with about a 50 on your cost threshold.
yep, that's a good starting point. Yep.
Thank you.
Also, what are you paying for licensing, right? So if you're gonna pay for certain SQL Server number of cores for licensing, you wanna make sure to use those as well. Otherwise, if you can drop those and then use the other cores for other processes like reporting, so just
Okay,
make sure
and
you
that's a good point.
line up your licensing with your cores.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
That's a good point.
and if you have a database heavy application like P21 is, and your max degree of parallelism is set at 0, I would stay away from that if you can, because that's basically telling it, use everything you got. That can cause lag on a lot of other queries that are smaller queries that people are doing day to day just for their job function. So having it at 0 is not a good way to start either.
Awesome,
So-
thank you, Brad. That's good stuff. I mean, we can go about SQL Server and dive in for probably the next 2 breakout sessions, but that's
Yeah,
great
talk
content.
all day, sorry.
Thank you, Brad. No worries at all. Thank you. All right, next we have load balancing. So this is where you get into multiple middleware servers, and this is where I'll hand it off to Marshall.
Yeah, so load balancing is really interesting tech. I build all of our load balancers here at Estes. We generally use Nginx, which is an open source web server technology. It's been around for a long time. It's used by lots of high traffic websites, Dropbox. There's more than 350 million websites on Nginx at this point, so I think it's starting to catch on. And there are lots of different methods of going about load balancing, and it's easy to misconfigure because it's a bit complicated, but it really does provide a lot of benefits. So, there's that N-tier aspect of it. It's infinitely scalable. So, say you acquire another company, bring them into your P21, suddenly you've got 100 more users. Or you can build up a middleware server and then just plop it into your Nginx configuration and you're good to go. And there's also the high availability aspect of it. So, if you have, say, 3 servers in your load balancer and one of them goes down, it won't get load balanced too. So it kind of saves your users a bit there. Now, Nginx is a software load balancer compared to a hardware load balancer, which is something that goes into your rack. Those are going to be a lot more expensive compared to just a Linux server in the cloud. So it runs a lot more lean and a lot more efficiently. And it also does reverse proxying. So it goes to your internal backend servers, your P21 servers, and it completes that connection with them and then goes back to the user. But it doesn't tell the user, I'm going to middleware server 3. It tells them, hey, you're at p21.companyname.com. So it kind of obfuscates everything and adds that extra layer of security. We see a lot of clients where it's very clear as soon as you log into P21, you can see the SQL server, you can see the app server, and it kind of gives a bit of an uncomfortable amount of visibility into your network. So I find that reverse proxying is a good way to cut back on that.
Excellent. Thanks, Marshall.
Yeah, of course.
I'll catch this next one. Internal load balancing. is also called header load balancing. And this is only applicable for the web UI. Other components like the middleware, proof of delivery, and API, these are only going to be able to connect to the primary middleware instance when you're using internal load balancing. With internal load balancing, you're only allowed to have one primary API server. So that's basically your lead API server and then the subsequent servers that you add. In the middleware setup, excuse me, you have to make sure that you grab that shared API key from your primary middleware instance, plug it into the rest. So now that you don't have a whole bunch of APIs you can connect to, you have one in that. And then also you have to run the middleware setup to be able to configure any of the servers to support internal load balancing. So when you do that, if you have any users on there, they're going to be disconnected. So it's not the most effective or efficient method, but it's one out there. Brad, I'm going to steal your saying about the ice cube tray. So internal load balancing is kind of like if you're filling up an ice cube tray, right? You tilt it, you fill up the one compartment first, and then it cascades down to the next one. So not the most efficient or effective, but it's out there. We use external load balancing. So Marshall, again, I'll hand this off to you.
Yeah, so we generally use principle of least connection. There's a lot of different ways to load balance. By default, it's round robin. So it's just going, if you have 3 servers, it's just going 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 over those 3 servers. But if Bob on server 1 doesn't log out for lunch, and say Susan on server B doesn't log out, then suddenly it's going to start to become imbalanced, and it's not the most efficient way to load balance. So we do least connection. So when someone logs into P21, it's going to look at all 3 of those servers, and it's going to go, okay, server C has the least amount of connections, so I'm going to send you there.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. This is a sort of topic within our breakout session here. We're going to go over some web server configuration, IIS, Internet Information Services, running the middleware setup. We'll go over some log and app pool maintenance, which is important, some of the scheduler, and then some server settings to help maximize performance of your system. So Internet Information Services, it's really important to have, if you have web servers, especially your P21 servers specifically, to make sure that they're dedicated for maximizing performance. Obviously, if they're running ancillary tasks, that's going to pull away from what they should be doing. So that's a recommendation. Also kind of goes into app pool recycling. The application isn't perfect. It's not self-healing or self-managing. So this is one way to help out, especially with RAM usage. You might see where RAM usage on your servers goes high, and then maybe in the afternoon, this is actually some feedback that we've gotten and some use case stuff, but you might have users that get disconnected just because the app pool freaks out and it's way too much. And so app pool recycling is going to help you manage that RAM usage on your web servers a bit better. Also with IIS, it's great because you can configure it to use memory limits. So with your application, the recommendation for the middleware servers was 48 gigs of RAM. That's with live and play. So you can assign memory limits within IIS so that you can limit, say, if you're running play on there as well, you can limit how much it uses so it's not pulling too much away from live. CPU affinity is another one along the lines of memory limits. You can assign the percentage of resources that's used within IIS as well. Next, we got the middleware setup. So these are some important items to make sure that you get right. It's going to help improve performance. Yeah, question.
Just a quick question on this issue that we've been having. We have 12 different locations with tons of front count orders going on. Some of them being 20 lines, whatever. Those run fine. We're seeing an issue where, like, a territory manager, let's say he gets like a bunch of stuff from an apartment complex and it's a 50-line order. overpowered. We have like 5 middleware servers. We've got everything we need. But once it starts hitting like the 30 line mark, we start seeing like some serious slowness going on and putting in lines.
Trying to add lines.
Yeah, when adding lines, yeah. And we don't know what's going on. They're still able to work, add those lines, but it's just seriously like slowing down big time. Like that load bar begins to like lag, and it's not as like smooth anymore and stuff.
Okay.
And we've tried slowing that down because we noticed that that little load bar can cause latency between putting in stuff. So we fixed that, but it still hasn't really done anything. We tweaked it using like a SQL script.
Okay. So use cases are special. We have a lot of questions, obviously, that go into surrounding that use case. So if you catch me afterwards, we can go over. But Brad, did you catch that? Does it sound familiar?
Pardon? What's that, sorry?
Did you catch the question for the order entry and the line queries?
I caught most of it. I missed the first couple seconds. It all dropped a bit.
Catch me afterwards if you'd like. We can go over some more details.
Yeah, sounds
Cool.
good.
So external server names is important within the middleware setup. We have sort of a running joke that's not that funny, but it's always DNS, right? DNS is an issue. So making sure you have your external server names correct and that match your valid SSL cert is important. And you want to be able to point, if you use the web application that points to the middleware, you're going to have to make sure those match up. One thing that we like to use in organizations that have multiple web servers and purposes, not just P21, say they have SSRS or another website, you can apply a wildcard certificate. So it's basically, you can say p21.estesgroup.com, that can serve your production instance. You can also say ssrs.estesgroup.com for your reporting stuff. So you can apply that wildcard. That's also in the middleware setup, also the web application setup. You have to make sure you get that right. And then update your yearly when it comes around to update. It's always fun. Hopefully you have that documented, that process down if you have access and you manage that sort of thing so that you can plug in your certs wherever you need to. The scheduler location is another one in the middleware setup that's really important because P21 only allows for one scheduler. So if you have multiple servers and you separate your scheduler or that scheduler is also supporting users, either way, you have to make sure that you point the other servers to the one scheduler. Otherwise, what's going to happen in the newer versions, it's going to install the application pool for the scheduler. You're going to have servers that are running that application pool, trying to pick up scheduled tasks, emails, things like that, and then you're going to start running into issues and errors and stuff not working. Edge agent is another one. So if you're going to use the edge agent specifically for scheduled task printing, this is another checkbox within the middleware setup. So keep that in mind. If you're using the edge agent and you say, well, let's start using it for scheduled tasks as well, like pick tickets or invoices and stuff like that, you have to make sure you define it in there. And then worker processes. Worker process is a good one. This is more of a use case thing. So what we've seen is that by default, it gets installed with just one worker process, and that serves the different application pools. And what you can change if it's recommended for that scenario is that you can change that. EPCOR recommends not going over 5, but basically that worker process is going to support your users, and rather than having one big bloated process, you can spread the load a little bit and hopefully manage your resource usage a little bit better. And I also want to point out that advanced settings is within the middleware setup, and if you've ran it before, you've probably gotten that notification that says only make changes here, recommended by EPCOR development. So keep that in mind. It's if you're curious about those settings or you think it might help, open an EPCOR case or open a ticket and then ask about it. Maybe it could help you, but keep that in mind. We're not saying change this, right? So it's important that you keep that in mind before changing those kind of settings. Next, we'll get into the service log. So this is part of web server maintenance, and it's really important. We mentioned it a bit earlier, is that the application isn't perfect, right? So we have to help manage the parts around it. One of those is the service logs. You might have adjusted your logging level, maybe you're troubleshooting an issue and you set it to verbose. Verbose gives you a bunch more detail, but that detail is logged into files. And so over here, this is just an example of a file structure, profit21.scheduler.servicelog. So this is in the service trace folder. When you adjust your logging level, that folder can get bloated. It's really small here in kilobytes, but I've seen it to where just this single log itself could be 60 gigs, and even higher than that. And that's just one service trace. So what we like to do is we like to create scripts to manage that. And then instead of having to go in there all the time, you can automate that stuff. So you can do that on a schedule. If you have an RMM, remote management tool, manage your servers, you can go in and schedule that and basically clean up these logs. Troubleshooting is a big one, so it's great. I've used it a whole bunch of times. Increase logging level, go in, troubleshoot. But it's important when you are changing the logging level that you go back and you change it back to warning, so you get less detail until you need it again. But also take a peek at the logs, because those logs will fill up your disk drive, and that's one of those pain points, and something that'll help improve performance as well. This is where you can get in and actually change it. So this is within the middleware setup. This one's advanced settings, so one of those things, make sure you check with Epicor or development or whoever manages P21 for you. Right here it's set to verbose. That's where you get all that detail that goes into your text files, your service logs that's going to load. If you've got a newer version, actually over here you can change it as well, not just the middleware setup. You can see that this one's 21.1.45.56. It's getting close to that last version where you can't have the desktop client anymore. But newer versions, you can actually go into system settings, and they've got a trace settings module under the system setup where you can change default logging level, the SOA logging level, UI, and scheduler logging level. So that's one location that you can go in, say, hey, I've got this issue, I'd like to get more information. Let me change my logging level, and that's how. 10 folders, this is another good one. I found this just digging through some Epicor stuff, but basically to help improve performance, Epicor recommends that in this folder, so if you're familiar with the P21 system settings files and folders, you can go in there and there's a scripts folder, right? You got wizard, reports folder, business rules, path, and there's a scripts folder location in there, and within that, it points to a temporary folder. So the temporary folder, you can change the logging level on that one as well. But what happens is something happens within P21, file gets processed, it gets put in this temporary location, and then it gets sent out if everything goes well. If it fails, it stays there. So for that P21 scripts UNC path within system settings, Epicor recommends that you have less than 3,000 files in there. Otherwise, your printing and emailing performance is going to suffer. So you can see in this one here, well, you might not be able to see that, it's pretty small, but there's almost 131,000 files in there. So that's quite a bit more than our 3,000 recommendations. So this customer was experiencing printing and emailing slowness. This is one of those paths. And this one's actually within the system setup, system settings, system setup, printing. And there's a Crystal Forms integration setting here where you can check it and put failed files only. So if you see that this folder in particular is growing a whole bunch, you can come in here and make sure that setting is set properly. And also just another thing that you can script and automate, and you can clean up that folder as well. You can look at things like last write time, go in there, it's older than this date, clean it up, get it out. Web application pool maintenance, how are we doing with time here? All right, good, another 10 minutes. This is for web application pool maintenance. This is one thing to look out for. We touched on the high RAM usage, maybe some drop connections in the afternoon, and then people sign back in and everything's good until the next day. But this chart is an example. So this is one of our reporting tools, but basically I want to point out RAM utilization is our green line. and on the left-hand side is our percent usage. So this is an example of a server that's running well. You can see a spike right here, so basically it's 8:15 Eastern. That might be where all the users are coming in. That's pretty typical. We actually had a conversation about that and a use case that would be pretty good. But this is a server that's happy, right? It's running RAM usage. It's up. It starts the day sub 20%, and then we're looking just under 50%. And at the end of the day, you can see it drops off. So that's where our nightly cleanup is cleaning up that application and dropping that baseline usage. Where we see issues is there's not a nightly IIS reset or application pool getting recycled. And so what that does, if you think about it, so if we're here at sub 50 or so at the end of the day, that might drop down as users start disconnecting, their sessions get cleaned up. But what happens is your percent usage is going to stay up. So say you start at 40 and now you're increasing, your baseline starts at 40% usage for the day. And if it increases, like this one, for example, close to 30%, now you're getting up to 70%, and that's where we see issues with the application pool and RAM usage. So that's something to keep in mind, is that just by recycling your application pools every night, IIS reset, reboot is going to work as well. It's going to do the same thing, but I'm not going to argue against a server reboot, so that'll work as well. But basically dropping your baseline so you can start out the day and you can have a happy server just like this one. We've covered advanced settings a bit, some different things that you can try, but also recommended that you check with Epicor or whoever manages your P21. You can change your worker process that we went over. And this is also an important one that is a struggle out there, is session cleanup. So if we have issues logging in where it's the number of licenses has been reached and you can't log in, that sort of thing, this is one setting that you can go in there. Epicor doesn't recommend going below 4 minutes for session cleanup time. You'll start seeing issues. And this is managed basically by your web client and your user. It's getting pinged every 3 minutes. So if it's idle, that's when that timer starts. This can also be scripted on the back end, SQL queries and things like that to manage your user sessions. And then some of the design, this is an example. We had set up an environment for the Lake Erie users group, and this is the Embassy Suites where we stayed, and basically this is sort of our private cloud environment for this Echo demo environment, and Echo is Estes Cloud hosting. But you can see the Embassy Suites. If this was a branch or headquarters for your organization, we'd set up an IPsec tunnel most likely. It's going to hit the firewall appliance, trickle down, you're going to P21, you hit the load balancer. Load balancer sends you to the middleware or the web UI. We've got 2 middleware servers here, so we've got our scheduler defined, and those both talk to SQL Server. For that user group, we had UiPath that had an application we deployed via our RDS, and then we also have our third-party and vendor-specific servers over here. If you have stuff like DocStar, TPCX is a big one, comp ratio, EDI stuff, and Tableau. So it's important that you put time and thought into the design of your environment to maximize performance. Yeah. 3? 30. Oh, 30? Okay, nice. Thank you. Speak to that. Nice. Do you have any questions on the design or anything like that? Next, we'll go into our schedulers. This one's important for web server. You can only have one scheduler if you have multiple middleware servers, and that's defined within your middleware setup. So it's important when you do have multiple middleware servers, you keep that in mind that you can only have one, so you have to define it in the middleware setup. One box is hard to see. Authentication. So this is a great use case, and there's an authentication mode that you can put and you can change within the middleware setup. So we had a company, large company, global, and they had a whole bunch of branches. And with those branches, they all have scheduled tasks. Things like pick tickets and invoices and the like. That's a lot of scheduled tasks that's up to one scheduler, basically. So what we were finding is that they were getting failures, and it wasn't just failure after failure after failure. It would be, so I mean, all the scheduled tasks they have, maybe it would be like once every 4 hours or something like that. So it wasn't terrible, but then again, It's something that you don't really want to sit on and deal with, so we want to solve the problem. And so we had put in, I think it was just a couple months with Epicor grinding on this issue, trying to figure it out and solve this problem on scheduled tasks. So if you're in a similar scenario, you have a bunch of scheduled tasks, you might have some failures here and there. One thing, and we're all looking for that magic solution, right? That one button that just solves all your problems. In this specific case, this was kind of the one. Basically, we changed within the middleware setup, you can choose your authentication mode. A lot of times you'll set it to mixed mode so that you can do Windows authentication, but you can also log into SQL. So your admin, PowerServe users, or you can authenticate to SQL Server and your Windows users. So if you're domain joined, you have users signing in as their domain user. Basically what we had set on the scheduler, and this was actually, I'm going to shout out Roger Morgan from Epicor, but basically he had come back and helped us out tremendously with this one. And it was changing it to SQL first mixed mode authentication. So this is a specific use case, but if you're seeing the same kind of thing, you have a whole bunch of scheduled tasks. What it was doing is once we changed it, it allowed that scheduler to authenticate quicker to SQL Server and execute those scheduled tasks because there was just a timeout happening. And all those scheduled tasks, when you want to try and not overlap, so you want to break out your scheduled task. This one starts now, the next one will go 4 minutes, and that sort of thing. So it was just allowing your scheduled tasks and your middleware server to authenticate quickly. So that was a great fix. And also keep in mind for larger organizations when you need to scale. Yeah, question.
So setting up for authentication, your scheduler was using a SQL account rather than a domain account?
Right, so in the middleware setup, you have to define your service accounts, right? But you also have to find your P21 user who's also a SQL user. And what was happening is the application pool was the Windows domain user service account and authenticating. But what we had found is that the SQL authentication, so that SQL service account that we had created, you can use admin. If you put in admin in the middleware setup, you're going to get that error that says admin is not recommended. Do you want to continue? Oftentimes you'll click OK, but basically it's recommended that you set up a SQL Server account to use in this scenario so that you can plug it into your middleware setup, and that authentication with SQL first is what made the difference for the scheduler. Yep. The sizing is also important. If you separate your scheduler and it's not supporting users, those recommendations that we covered earlier, the virtual machine middle recommendations, 4 cores, 48 gigs RAM, you don't have to apply those same rules to the scheduler, so you can downsize and save some there and not have to have the full-on 48 gigs of RAM to where it's underutilizing those resources. It's one thing to keep in mind as you scale your environment a bit more, or maybe it's already scaled and you can monitor performance on that scheduler server and see if you can downsize and save some resources there. So this is our last slide on web server settings. This would be just kind of general. So this is for Windows Server. You can go in and by default, Windows, you create a virtual machine. Windows you have a power mode. So you can go in and basically set your power mode. Instead of being balanced by default, you can go in there and set it to high performance. That's great. Button, simple setting, go in and change. So you got a new machine that you're rolling out. You got a new middleware server, that sort of thing. You want to set it up to maximize performance. That's one of those settings that we recommend. NIC no sleep is another one. So a NIC is a network interface card. And what happens by default as well is that there's a checkbox on the network card that says basically if it's not being used, that it can go to sleep. So it's not the greatest thing when you're thinking about supporting P21 users. So for example, if you go home and come back in the morning and you try and log in you get some weird error that says this server, this client not available, that sort of thing. So you clear your cache, do an incognito window, you might reboot your PC, that sort of thing. And then you come back and you log in and it works. That's weird. But what might be happening is that this checkbox is just enabled on your network card that says allow this network card to sleep, which is not ideal when we're talking about maximizing performance and availability for your system. That's a simple setting that you can check along with high performance. And then our running joke for the DNS servers, you have to make sure, this is also set on your network card, you have to make sure these are correct. So when you get into different branches, say you have 5 different branches, all these branches have a domain controller within them that they authenticate to, and you have sites and services. And you want to make sure that your primary DNS server is set properly so that you're not authenticating, say, to branch 4 from branch 1. You want to be able to be in branch 1 and all that traffic to go to your primary DNS server so that you're not trying to authenticate somewhere else, basically. So that's going to help improve performance and also knock out some of those DNS issues that we see. The subnet is also an important one. Same place, network card. You want to make sure this is correct. Not to get too nerdy, but in the networking stuff, but if you have a /24 subnet, right, and really it's a /22, but you have a /24, so it's basically saying these number of IP addresses are allowed to talk to this server. But if you fall outside, if your workstation for some reason gets an IP address and it falls outside of that range, then you're going to start seeing issues trying to authenticate, and that's an issue. System performance is another one. That's another setting. When you say you've got that new virtual machine, you're setting it up, and one thing that you can do is turn off animations. That's a simple setting to change. You can adjust your page file to improve performance as well. There's also a visual effects setting that you can change on here as well, so that's going to help, and that's going to help tune your web server to get the most bang for your buck, increase performance. All right, so I'm going to repeat this again. We had it in the beginning slides, but optimizing performance for your system it's not a destination, right? You can't take all these today, go home and set them and increase your performance and then set it and then call it a day. It's a journey, right? So we're always constantly trying to improve different things to help out and help your business run better. Hopefully you got some stuff to implement, and then you can go home and implement right away. Stuff that you can start planning for as well. It takes time, especially you get more complex systems. Change takes a bit of time, so you start opening that conversation a bit earlier. You can get stuff done a bit faster and help your business run a bit better. And also, we got a little better idea and sort of view into what happens on the back end of P21, some of the server stuff, SQL server stuff, web server, IIS, that sort of thing. So hopefully you got a better idea. And I want to thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us. And we've got a couple of additional slides here to go over, but that wraps up the main content of our slides, and we'll get into some more questions and answers here shortly as well. But Brad, do you mind covering our virtual summit?
Sure. Just a heads up that we wanted to kind of talk to our community. So during the pandemic, we did several virtual online summits. We had nowhere to go and everyone was kind of locked together. So we said, okay, why don't we turn this to an opportunity to reach out to our own user community and kind of extend that. So we have one coming up in the fall. We have right at the back of the room little cards to remind you with a little barcode that you can scan and get to the registration site. So we're going to do a bunch of sessions. Brad Van had a session that he had planned to give to the Erie chapter on optimizing SQL queries, so covering similar topics but at another level of granularity, so we're going to be doing that. We got Brent is going to be doing a session on kind of more system architecture best practices, kind of at the server level, not necessarily related just to performance, but kind of overall. We're going to probably do a session on financial activity and something more on the operations side. So we're going to cover a gamut of different topics, pull in some of our friends and colleagues here. So we'd love to see you all go part of that. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Brett. Yep, that's gonna be awesome. So now we'll take some questions. Hopefully we have some answers for you. Anyone have any specific questions that might have come up or something you wanted to cover?
I had one, Caleb. I noticed there's a lot of places where you're talking about settings. Are any of these non-negotiable after initial, or can all of those settings be changed even if you missize them initially? Like whether it's a web server or kind of your database page size and such, are there any places where if you set it wrong to begin with, it's really hard to roll it back, or is this all relatively flexible?
It's a good question. Yeah, it's really important. And most of the stuff is flexible. Where you get to where it gets messy is when you start getting into drives, right? Because that includes formatting, reformatting. So, for example, if you provision a server and you only provision a C drive, and you install all your applications, all your stuff, and it sits all on one drive, and it has a whole bunch of space. Well, there's two things there. For number one, I'd recommend that you just run your operating system basically on your C drive, right? And then you have a separate drive provisioned if you can to help support all the other stuff. So where that helps is you have a separate drive that's formatted specifically for what you're doing, but also now if you have an application like we talked about the service logs, for example, if your drive fills up on C drive, your server's down. Your server's down, and it's going to be hard to get back up because now your operating system drive is full, and Windows can't turn on and boot. So that's a good recommendation. So that's most of these settings are flexible, but that's one where it's more difficult and messy, especially if you're trying to resize the disk. Like we gave this disk 500. I'm only using 50 gigs. Storage can be somewhat cheap, but if you're trying to change anywhere you can, that's one thing. Where it says, well, let's just shrink the drive, and that gets messy when you include the operating system in that as well. So that's one thing that is trickier. If it's a different drive that's not on your operating system, for example, you can go in, create a new drive if you have that. If you have the access, you can copy all your folders, remove the one, and so you want to reformat to support the right size and then move your copied folders over there. So then that's going to help as well. But yeah, mostly configurable. You can go back in and change these settings to get them to where you want them to be.
Do you recommend doing this in play first in most cases, or are these some of these things tweaks you can make in the production environment without too much risk?
I will usually always recommend make them in play or test first, right? So it's especially from the managed services side, where I was part of the help desk, I still am, and you get those tickets where it's an emergency, we have users down, and something just happened where it was changed in live, and it just didn't work out the way it was supposed to, unfortunately. So I would always say, recommend, if you can, change them in test, try it out, and then when you're ready, get a maintenance window outside of business hours, that sort of thing, test it out, and make those settings there. Yeah.
Have y'all noticed any performance changes based on what browser they use?
Oh yeah.
Google Chrome, Edge, Mozilla, Brave, whatever.
Yep, it does make a difference. So I think Epicor just recommends, I think it's 3 browsers, right? It's Chrome, Edge, and I think Firefox is in there as well, although we've been kind of running into some issues with Firefox too.
Yeah, one of the things you can do with Chrome is actually uninstall it, and when you reinstall it, uncheck that box that says help Google, because if you don't, it puts a couple of services in the back end,
Right.
and it runs all the time. The other thing is to disable the GP update that's in services for Chrome, and that'll allow it to run a lot faster too.
Gotcha.
But Firefox has been having some issues as of late. And Edge always has problems.
I've been seeing a lot of adware on Google Chrome on our web servers. So, we'll have users with adware just popping up and weird, they'll click some random, but the adware will guide you to a malware site. So I've been seeing that at least 2 a week.
I don't see a whole lot of adware. Basically, what's happening is when your end user is using that, their tracking is turned on.
Right.
Turn that off. Because they always say the first part about an end user is education. Educate the user. So, the user doesn't know any better. They're going to click on it and go, oh, this looks cool. And then next thing you know, your tracking information has gone out to 15 more sites, and now you're getting more and more and more. And everybody hates to have to clear their cache and so forth, because with the web UI, you have to reinvent the wheel when you do that.
Exactly. And we clear our cache every night.
Why?
Just for performance. We have people, somebody's looking up shoes and they have 15 pages just with shoes, and they allow pop-ups because they want to know when the newest shoe deal is up. So now we're kind of like, okay, do we go to our firewalls and just start blocking shopping because people are just searching, doing their thing?
It's a hard line to cross, just from the simple point of keeping your end user happy, especially for sales guys that they're trying to search for product. Some web filters, they filter out firearms.
Right.
Yet you have a company that makes parts for Winchester and now they can't find those parts. They're being told no. It's just it's like doing the right thing when nobody's looking, and continuing to do it.
Integrity.
Yes, very much so.
Cool.
There are ad blocking methodologies you can use too.
To that point, doing the right thing, we have an acceptable use policy that everybody has to sign, everybody in the business has to sign every year. And if you're found in violation, it can be immediate termination. So that might be another way around that, where just re-educate users.
Remind them what they signed.
Yeah, what the company policies are, and you're signing this acceptable use policy, if you're not following it, and you're shopping for shoes when you're supposed to be.
Well, I'll be honest with you.
Then you're violating the acceptable use policy.
When I was on the I was on that end user side. I was the IT manager, and the CEO would, about once a month, he would just pick 3 people and say, run a report for the whole month on them. I want to know where they've been. And you could tell how long they've been in P21 and how long they've been doing everything else. And he was always good about, second chances. He's like, I'm going to let you know first that I know. Because, it comes back into play of every second's money,
Right.
And if you're 15 minutes, you're on your lunch, you're doing whatever. But, when you're sitting there, I know a lot of companies that they're not even allowed to use their cell phone sitting in the office. They're told leave it in your car. Otherwise, you got folks sitting at their desk doing this.
Exactly. Or, they use that downtime to look for shoes.
Yep.
Whatever it may be.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a great point.
Quick way we do it. You can use Google profiles, and we actually have 2 icons. This is your personal icon.
Yep.
Go do your shoe shopping on it. Okay, if you load up your cache on it, no harm, no foul. But the other one is P21 only. Okay, and that's your business one. And because they only go to P21, the cache doesn't fill up near as quickly. Okay, so it's just a way of separating. Same program, 2 profiles.
That's a good idea, a good
We
suggestion,
have
because
our company policy says that if you're on your lunch hour,
Yeah.
as long as you don't go to porn,
Yep.
adult sites, we have a list that you can't go to. But if you're on your lunch hour and you want to do something like that, you're allowed. But do it on your personal profile, not on the P20.
but with the company profile too, from an IT perspective, is changing systems. they can go sit at somebody else's desk, log into Google, and now they have all their, some usernames, passwords, their bookmarks. It's not reinventing the wheel when they go to sit down somewhere else, or if they go to another branch, or even if they're at home.
There are multiple ways to manage it, right?
Yeah.
In policies, that's a great example, different profiles, and then your IT team should be able to manage that as well. Networking stuff.
IT team stuff.
There we go.
That's me.
I think I heard earlier that you said Chrome on a server. Is that what I heard?
Yes.
You want to talk about how that impacts performance?
Yeah, so I mean,
Taylor's
Brendan-
very against it.
Brent brought up a great point. There's things that you can do to try and regulate what Chrome does, but also on a web server, it's not recommended to have a browser on there as well, or even users on your web server if you can avoid it on any server. So what Chrome can do is if you don't regulate it, it gets the keys to update whenever it wants to. So ties right in with our slides, right? Maximizing system performance. If you got a production server that's running Google updates unfiltered whenever it wants to, that's not a good idea.
Because it's not just updating Google. All the cookies that are out there, it's updating them. It's,
And extensions, all that stuff.
everything.
It's all a security question as well. So
Yeah.
Stuff in there.
That's right.
So, kind of piggybacking off the end user side of things, one of the issues that we run into a lot is we have an older user base, and we switched over to the web UI last year completely. There's been a lot of pushback since then.
Oh, yeah.
We run into issues where all we hear is just, it's slow, it doesn't work, I don't know what's happening. And so be able to identify issues, what's actually causing the problem. Is it the end user, or is it the system? Is it P21 in general? Because it's still, a lot of times they refer to terminal server as P21 because they're just used to saying, I have to go in there for P21. What's kind of best practices in terms of getting more information out of them, identifying what the issue is, and kind of troubleshooting?
Run a trace.
Getting more data, I guess.
When they're doing what they're doing, do you know how to run a trace in the web browser?
I don't know.
Is it F12? F12 opens the trace.
Right? Like a hard file?
Yeah. And it'll capture every keystroke, everything they're doing. It'll tell you where it slows down, where it speeds up, why it's slowing down, and you can take that HAR file and actually analyze it. I will say this, 2023, I honestly haven't heard a single complaint about it, and the searching's faster. I mean, like the on-the-fly search where you're typing, and even just the search window opening, I don't know what they did, but it's like 50% faster than 2022, and of course, 2021's
22.1, and I've heard update to 2023.
Well, there's a couple of other things within that too, is that with 2023, nobody makes mistakes in the play system thinking it's live anymore because it's pink. Wireless warehouse. There's a whole brand new interface for warehouse guns with a P21 WMS, which I'm going to tell you, based on where they were, because they were using the same desktop as everybody else, now it's kind of like the old RF mode where they had just their menus and so forth. The new one has just big buttons, and it's designed for a warehouse guy. It's designed for the gun. You don't have to go resize everything and all that mess.
So there's a lot of things that you can look into there, but some of the stuff we covered. The SQL trace is great within the application SQL side. The maximizing performance. So if you're improving queries, you can do that as well. And then sometimes it comes down to database maintenance. We touched on some of this stuff, but one of the
indexing.
Yeah, re-indexing.
Do you re-index every night
That's a good question.
in your maintenance plan?
So we're a little bit of a unique situation where we're kind of a smaller family-sized business. I'm the young one at the company, so I get all of the IT-related questions. I don't have an
Okay.
IT background. We have a third-party IT company, or really just one guy that does all of our heavy-duty IT stuff.
Okay.
I'm his main pivot from that, and so once we made the jump from the web UI, I've been kind of thrust into the IT world, but I also am our accounts payable manager, so I don't have time to do all the IT stuff, and so it's kind of I have a basic understanding. It's obviously a huge problem in a lot more complex world than I have time to get into. So part of it is I'm starting to try to identify how much of an issue is this for us as a company, because we hear it nonstop from our users, and it then makes it so that I have to drop everything I'm doing to jump into the world. And is it now becoming a full-time thing where okay, I need to start focusing resources here so that we can eliminate some of the issues and improve efficiency across the board in that sense. So a lot of those questions I don't know the answers to. I'll call up our guy Roger and say, hey, explain this for me. So,
We see a lot of different things, a lot of different people based on the environments you're in, and you have a great SQL guy or you don't have one. But even like in your maintenance plan, simple reindexing and circular logging, for like translogs, because if you don't have those truncated, you're going to end up with translogs, terabytes. I mean, and then you're wondering why it's going so slow. So, what you got?
P21 has an event log as well, so if your users have tuned out, they're not reporting problems, there's like a date range where you can open it up to all server users, so you can run that and get an idea of like how many people are having problems. Are they all on the same server? Are they all using this?
Does everybody have the same issue at the same time?
So that helps a lot of times as well. It's like your starting point to debug.
yeah, and that's always been tough too. Is just gauging the threshold for users on what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, because it seems to differ by everybody. You know, I run it every day. I have no issues, but my threshold I think is a lot higher than some of our other users who, if it takes 2 seconds, it's like, you know, this thing's so slow.
I've seen
Into the world.
I've seen folks that hit the keys faster than the screen will change.
Yeah.
And you know, there was a noticeable slowdown in the beginning going from the desktop to the web UI. And that was one of the biggest complaints that I was hearing was, I'm going, and now I have to stop and wait.
Yeah.
And then the screen will go, catch up, and then they start going again. But I mean, you know, a lot of things have improved. You know, there's big improvements between the desktop, you know, the hybrid of desktop in 2021. There's also a lot of bugs in that version. You know, and if you contact Epicor, the first thing they're going to do is tell you to upgrade.
Yeah.
You know, and at that point, it's a rip the Band-Aid off. If you want it fixed.
And
So
SQL Server is the back end of your business, right? So there's a whole bunch of stuff to do to make sure SQL's happy that might help you there. And we covered some of the backup plans. So basically here, if you're doing full backups and transaction log backups, that's really going to make a difference. So if you set that your transaction log backups to run like every hour during business hours, now that's helping out your database, but it's also helping you on your disk size as well, right? And then work loss exposure. So now we're talking about if something happens and you need to recover data, you can possibly go from an hour ago to instead of hopefully last night's backup. So another thing to keep in mind. And then reindexing is another important one too. There's a trade-off between how often you reindex your databases, but this is going to help SQL optimize the queries on those tables. So instead of querying the whole table of all the data itself, it's going to grab optimized data, and that's important. These other items that Brad touched on as well are things to look at. So there's a whole bunch of stuff to do to make sure that SQL's happy, and that's a big part of it.
Right. Okay.
Question?
Did you guys run into issues with web UI and licenses? Scale licenses not releasing. We're at 23.1. They keep saying it's going to start working, and it's not.
Yeah, that's a good one.
yeah,
Very, very common, right? So we covered the middleware setup where there's the session cleanup. That's one way to do it. There's also some stuff you can do on the back end for SQL. You can like create a SQL job, and you can query some of those management views and see user activity, when's the last right time, and then some trigger, or you can schedule it to where it'll clean up those sessions. So there's some different things you can do.
We just had to go in there manually into the
do you have your
Very common.
fire them all.
do you have the timeout threshold set?
Yeah, you did those work. They'll be logged in 5 times. They have one window open and just sit there.
Yeah, I see
Yeah,
the back end SQL stuff.
We're hearing that.
Of that.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, you know, The RDS farm sometimes doesn't, even though you have the timeout set, it's supposed to disconnect. Never does.
Yeah, so it gets a little complex. Yeah, question.
Quick one was here. The version 2023, we still need to do the Apple recycle.
That's a great question. So, I mean, 23 is fairly new, so we don't have a whole lot of use case and time to put towards that. But it's still recommended. Also, if depending on your environment and the reporting tools you have, you can monitor that stuff as well. And based on your historical data, how far back you go, right? So now you can compare the last 2 weeks since we upgraded to 23.1 versus the last 2 months before that. So that's something to keep in mind that you can go back and compare. So that's a good one. It's important. The application pool. I mean, if there's a memory leak or something like that, it just doesn't do the greatest at managing itself when it's up to that threshold where it starts having issues.
You know, I'll tell you, keep an eye on the WUG. You know, the WUG form. I mean, I'll tell you a simple printer action. They're in the desktop web UI. They were printing their GL every month in the desktop because they couldn't get it to print. 'Cause it's the Power Builder file. They couldn't get it to print the web UI. All of Epicor's recommended resolutions for that were ridiculous in how intrusive it was to the system itself. Guy had on the WUG, checked the print spooler, went in there on that middleware server. Not sure how it happened, but the print spooler was completely disabled. So I just re-enabled it, hit start, and their web UI for the Power Builder started printing, and it was a simple print spooler was stopped. So don't always just think everything you get. You know, I'm gonna tell you, the WUG, from the years I've used it, that's got better troubleshooting than Epicor will ever have.
All angles, right? Search all the resources you have in the WUG is definitely a great resource to use.
Use your resources that you meet here.
Any other questions? I think we're about out of time here. Awesome. Well, thanks again for coming.
Yes.
Hopefully we can help out and we'll see you around. And thanks, Marshall and Brad.